because we're trying to condense a full day training down into an hour and a half, again, there are definitely some things that we won't be able to touch on today, and some things that we'll kind of have to leave out. And John and I will tag team through this. John and I are both with the IEP Technical Assistance Center as technical assistance specialists. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but hopefully it just means we can provide whatever support that anyone needs on a variety of topics. Welcome, Kara. We are just getting started. You guys feel free to unmute anytime. It is going to be just a super small group. And John, you can jump in anytime when it comes to the content too, and just tell me when you want to take over on something.
I'll do that.
I know you will. All right.
Tammy,
go ahead, John.
I was just going to ask Tammy, you were principal at what level?
I'm at the elementary level.
Elementary. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
So here's what we are hoping to cover in this short amount of time. Some things related to procedures that are both legally compliant and that also support accountability. So we're going to talk a little bit about the notice of procedural safeguards and some of the guidelines around those. Talk a little bit about some of the key timelines. There are a ton of timelines when you start digging through Article 7, and we'll talk about some of the key ones, but we'll also try to point out these are the ones that if you didn't pay attention to any others, these are the ones that have some serious consequences. So if nothing else, don't mess with these timelines. And then we'll also talk about implementing the IEP and what that actually means, and when do you have to do it, and how do you do it. Then we'll jump into a little bit about the IEP meeting itself for the case conference meeting, depending on the lingo that's used within your district, some of the procedures and the etiquette around those, and then a little bit about placement decisions and what you need to consider as the administrator as you are kind of leading this discussion. And then finally, we'll jump into behavior. And behavior is always a fun topic. Not really. Most people get a little frustrated when it comes to behavior. But we'll start with the end of looking at the prevention end of things first, and how to respond to different behaviors. And then we'll jump more into the actual disciplinary piece. And ultimately, if it came down to it, manifestation determinations. So I think those are probably the least favorite meetings that administrators have, but they're incredibly important that we know the law around them and that we're doing them in a way that is both fair to the student, fair to the school, that helps promote positive changes so that we don't end up there again. And that's, a lot of times when we have those meetings, it's about, let's never come back to this. let's make some changes so that we don't end up back here. So again, that's what we're hoping to cover. This will kind of be our first chance of condensing this down into an online version. So you guys get to be the guinea pigs today for this. There are a number of resources, and John, maybe you can also put this link in the chat for me while I'm talking. We have some resources that you can find on a Padlet. So you can either scan the QR code, or you can't click this link, but once John puts it in the chat, you'll be able to click the link to get there. And you can find this handout there, although on the Padlet, you're going to have the full day's worth of handouts. So it'll have all of these slides, as well as some additional slides that are in there that you can learn from, even if we haven't talked about them here. So let's start with the compliance piece. And this is very important, because most things that are related to compliance can lead to some serious consequences when it comes to violating the procedures and the rights that are afforded to parents and students, as well as making sure that we're compliant in some of the things that are required by both the federal and the state government when it comes to things like timelines. So we're going to start with the notice of procedural safeguards. And most people just refer to this as parent rights. I'm going to give you your parent rights. I'm going to explain your parent rights. But the formal term just is notice of procedural safeguards, or NOPS. So it says within our federal law that we have to make sure that we're providing lots of different kinds of notice, not just the parent rights or the procedural safeguards, but we have to give notice to parents for things like if we're going to make some changes to their program, you got to tell them first in writing. We have to make sure that we are, again, in writing, giving parents the notice that we want to hold a meeting so that hopefully they can be there. We have to get written consent before we do evaluations, before we place a child in special education. Even if a parent has given full consent for testing, and we get to that meeting and we all sit down together and say, absolutely, we believe this child qualifies for special education. It still takes one more signature from a parent to say, I'm okay with you starting this special education thing with them, right? Parents have a lot of control along the way. Now, once kids are in, that kind of diminishes a little bit, but we still have to make sure that parents are involved and aware of everything that is going on. And transparency is just such a good thing to have with parents. We have so many fewer problems with parents being upset if they just know, if they just know what's going on. And we also, as part of the safeguards, we know that parents can ask for an independent educational evaluation at the public school's expense if they disagree with our school evaluation. There's a lot more to that because parents don't even have to tell us why they disagree. We can ask, but they don't have to tell us. All we know is if we do an evaluation, they do have the opportunity to ask for an independent evaluation. Hopefully, if we do a good job on ours, they don't ask for them. Most of the time, they're not asking for those things. But there's a lot of stuff in parent rights, a lot more than what is bulleted here. So it is a legal requirement that at least once a year, we offer up these parent rights and give some kind of explanation to parents. Now that's once a year, plus a bunch of other times. So it tells us that the first time that we're even evaluating, or parents have requested an evaluation, or the school has proposed to do an evaluation, we have to give parent rights to them at that point, which makes a whole lot of sense, right? I don't want to sign the new Apple agreement until I've read it. Same thing with parent rights. Tell me what I'm getting into before I sign my life away on this. We also have to give the notice the first time, and you hope that there's no more than ever a first time, but the first time that a parent files a complaint in a single school year, or the first time that they send a request for a due process hearing. After that, you don't, but the first time you have to make sure that immediately we're giving those to parents. Now, number 4 is a little bit different, because on number 4, this has to do with manifestation determinations, basically. So if we get to the point to where discipline has been handed down that will ultimately result in a disciplinary change of placement, on the day that decision is made, parents need to get another copy of their parent rights. And you wouldn't think that this would be a big deal, but I'm telling you, I have been through hearings that had to do with just the fact that the school failed to give these rights to parents on that occasion. So it really is a critical thing to make sure that you know, which means not only having these available in the meeting where you normally do your conferences, but your principal's office, dean of students, anybody who might be making those kinds of decisions and calling a parent saying, I need you to come pick Jimmy up here because he's going to be going home for a few days, right? That you have those ready to give to the parent at that point, and make sure you know what's in those things. That's another piece. And then the last situation is just anytime a parent requests them. Yes, I got a copy last week, but if I ask you for another copy, make a copy available to the parent. So I have been in a meeting where I had a director who was kind of a little spitfire anyway, and she said to the parent, who was very upset at the time anyway, here are your parent rights. Would you like me to explain them to me or explain them to you, or would you like me to read them to you? And the parent went, yeah, read them to me. So the rest of us took a break for about an hour and a half while she word for word read the notice of procedural safeguards to the parent. I would not offer to do that. However, it is important that anything that a parent gets is in a language that's understandable to them, which means if it needs to be in a different language, we got to find that. And we already have that readily available in a lot of our documents that the state has in various languages. But sometimes it's not about the language. It's about, there's some pretty high level vocabulary in there. And sometimes parents don't want to say, I don't get this, I can't read this, I'm not sure what to do. So I think the procedure normally is, we pass the piece of paper across the table and then say, let me know if you have any questions. Or do you have any questions? They don't know what questions to have. And so I know for me, my background is as a school psychologist. And so I kind of have my own little elevator speech that is, there's a ton of stuff in here, but let me just tell you for today, here are some key things that I want to make sure that you're aware of. So I talk about confidentiality. I talk about, parent consent needing to happen, that they'll be invited every year to a meeting and that they can call a meeting if they need it, whatever the key things would be. I just hit those quick high points and then let them know who they can contact if they have additional questions. But I would just encourage you to develop your own little elevator speech so that it's never just the slide across the table. All right, let's talk a little bit about timelines. We have a lot of them, many, many timelines, and probably a lot of timelines within the world of special education that maybe you all don't have to deal with because maybe your director is addressing those timelines, when to submit certain things. But here are some things that kind of stand out that the administrators in the buildings really need to know. So we have some key things that are in Article 7. One is when we get a request for an evaluation, we have a specific timeline related to that. Let me just check. I have slides on all of these. Okay. One has to do with getting that evaluation done and holding our meeting, holding case conferences, regular annual case conferences, when we have to implement the IEP, and then timelines around move-in conferences. So we're going to talk about each one of these. So let's start with a referral. And this has to do with a parent request for either initial evaluation or for reevaluation. When the school is requesting it, the school is not really operating on a timeline other than if they have a concern, they need to get on it. They need to meet with the parent and they need to take action. But when a parent makes a request, they can make this request to anyone who is certified or who has a license, basically some sort of educational license, which means they may make it to their classroom teacher. They may make it to the principal. It could be anybody. And when that happens, whether it's in writing or whether it's just by word of mouth saying, I really want my kid tested, then we as a school have 10 instructional days, so days that we're actually in session with students, to provide written notice of our response. Now, the good thing is that that's about 2 weeks of school. So that means we have time to consider the data, to gather some data, to maybe gather people and have a quick meeting. And I would even consider a meeting with the parent. If they're the one that had the concern that brought this up, it's good to pull parents in, or even have a phone conference to say, tell me what your concerns are. Tell me what you're seeing at home. You know, whatever has led to this, because we don't often disagree with parent referrals for testing, unless they tend to come in like as a storm, which sometimes happens, right? You get a whole flood of them because somebody has told parents, all you have to do is ask for it. Well, we also have to suspect that there's a disability before we're going to do testing. And so we need to make sure that we look at all the data. So,
Yeah, Angela, that communication is important, because during parent-teacher conferences or just having a parent in, we've had parents that say, I think my child ought to be tested. Just to make that casual off-the-cuff comment. And are you requesting testing? I mean, we have to, first of all, teachers have to know that once a parent makes a request verbally, as well as in writing, but verbally, then we're on the clock. And we need to clarify, is this a request? Because they will make those comments, and later they can come back and say, well, I mentioned it during parent-teacher conferences. So it's really important that we have that communication with the teachers so that they follow up on that, and certainly report that to the administration, teacher of record, who would be the teacher of record, the special education department, so we can act on that.
It's really important that that written response is not just a form letter either. There are quite a few things that are required as part of this written notice to the parent. And so definitely use the forms that are provided within the Indiana IEP system. So that would either be a notice of refusal, because that notice will tell parents about their rights if they disagree with what the school is saying. And it also forces you to put in there what data you use to turn it down, right? And I think anytime, I've sent a lot of refusals in my career, but I don't think I've ever sent a refusal without a parent contact first saying, tell me what you think about this. And we've agreed together in most of those cases that testing was not really what we needed to do. What we needed to do is some good interventions or, something else. And, or, parents who you've called and said, I see that you've requested testing, and let me tell you all about that. And they say, wait a minute, I wasn't talking about special ed. I don't want that, right? So even when the parent almost takes it back, I go ahead and document our response through a notice of refusal. And then on the flip side of that is, if we're responding that yes, we're on board with this, they should be presented with the consent for evaluation form. And it's going to contain, again, all of the required elements that Article 7 says you have to have in there. All right, once we've gotten permission for either an initial or a, well, actually, let me stick to initials here. When we have permission, then we have to both get the evaluation completed with all its necessary parts and hold that case conference, typically within 50 instructional days. Now you'll notice we purposefully put instructional in here because there are a couple of places in Article 7 that talk about business days, and those are different. So when we get there, we'll talk about that. But most everything is done within 50 days. However, there's a situation where we operate on a 20 instructional day timeline if by using an intervention process, we've basically put things in place, the student has not made the progress that they should have based on our interventions, and we've all agreed that basically we have enough data already to move forward. And so there typically isn't a ton of testing that needs to be done. This is not very widely used in the state of Indiana, mainly because most schools' intervention process is not quite where it needs to be. And so we don't walk away from that with the data that we needed. Also, if a student is within the period of asking for that evaluation, they suddenly are suspended or they're in a state of expulsion. That means things are critical. We need to speed them up. And so it becomes an expedited evaluation as well. This only applies to initial evaluations though, not to reevaluations. And then we have our little bitty kiddos coming to us from the first step system. So from early intervention. And if they are in first steps and it's determined that they need to have an evaluation and potentially go into the public school preschool program for students with disabilities, then we need to make sure that the evaluation is completed and a program is ready for them to start on their third birthday. No matter when it falls during the year, we get that ready by their third birthday. And the intent there is just to make sure that there's no lapse in service. With the little ones, we want to make sure everything's nice and continuous for them and there's no, waiting a couple of weeks to stop one thing and start another. So it just flows. There are different kinds of reevaluation timelines. And so for any of your teachers who fill these kind of forms out in the system, it will basically ask questions to figure out which kind of timeline they're on. If we're just looking to provide some updates and reestablish eligibility, which sometimes we do, as when kids hit different ages, we say, you know what, we just need to get a good update. Then that reevaluation has to be completed in conference by the next annual case review. So typically you talk about it 1 year and then you complete it sometime during the next year and meet about it. If you need things sooner, and you're going to need them sooner if we are wanting to dismiss a student from something, if we are wanting to add an eligibility area, or if we need information to change how we respond to this kid, to inform our decisions, our instruction, then we want it quicker. And so that changes it to a 50-day timeline. And again, those are instructional days. And again, don't hesitate to stop me if you have any questions. I will tell you that there is a federal indicator that is tied to both of those first steps evaluations, kids moving from first steps to public school, and to initial evaluations in general. And those things are critical. Do not, under any circumstances, if you can ever help it, not meet those timelines. Those are absolutely critical. It's still important, absolutely important, but it is less painful to miss a reevaluation. I mean, if I'm a week late on a reevaluation, generally, I don't have anybody even asking me about it. Again, it's part of the law to follow the timelines that we have, but it is not being monitored in the same way, if that makes sense. So as administrators, if you got to put out one fire over another, put out the fires of those initial timelines over the reevals, because at least with the student who's getting a reevaluation, they're already receiving services. A couple of other things related to evaluations. Parents can request a copy of the evaluation report for initials. And in this case, if they do, they can get this up to 5 days or at least 5 days prior to the meeting. they mark this when they actually sign off on the permission form to begin with, and some parents just don't mark it. And I think for a lot of schools, the common practice is whether you ask for it or not, we're going to try to get it to you 5 days in advance, because I don't think it's fair for a parent to have to process all new information at a case conference meeting with a room full of people sitting and staring at me as I'm reading things about my kid that might not feel so good sometimes. So that's really the purpose of giving them the report ahead of time. And if they don't ask for it and we didn't get them the report in advance, we always have a copy of the report at no cost to the parent to provide to them at the case conference. Parents can also request a meeting, and the first one is at least 5 days prior to that scheduled meeting. This one, they can ask for an additional meeting, generally just with the psychologist or the OT or the speech pathologist, whoever has done the bulk of the testing. But it's sitting down with them within 5 days prior to that meeting, just to kind of go over the results. This sounds like it's a lot of extra time, but honestly, it can save you so much time at the big meeting where you've got a lot of bodies there to fully explain something to a parent ahead of time so that they are mentally and emotionally prepared for getting into that meeting. And then you can skim things a little bit more at the case conference.
Yeah, Angela, that's critical. Having that one-on-one or that very intimate, so to speak, meeting with the parent, explaining what this really means and what we can do for their child. We show that we value their child, we value them, we want to serve them. So I can't stress enough, not only offering that, but really encouraging that with parents, that you sit down, or that the school psychologist sits down with the parent and goes through that.
I think that the one caveat to that is making sure, and that if your staff is not already very well versed in this, that they always stick to language that, I'm going to explain this. Decisions will be made at the case conference. We don't want any kind of predetermination happening. So making sure that all the final decisions about eligibility, about placement, about everything really is at the case conference by the larger team, to which the parents are a part of. So we have to make sure that they really understand you are a team member. You are probably the most valuable team member there. And we need to make sure that they have a good handle on that.
Yeah, any discussion of that data, it's just the facts. We're just
With the facts, ma'am.
staying with the facts. Yeah.
We require that reevaluation is considered for a student at least every 3 years. Back in the day, even in my early days, we just reevaluated every 3 years. And there was a lot of testing happening back then. Now we just have to consider it every 3 years. If it's needed, we do it. If it isn't, we don't. But we review things. Now, the way that the IEP system works, it basically forces you to have that discussion at least on a surface level every year. So every time I meet, it's going to ask those questions about, do we need any new data? Have we thought about whether a reevaluation is needed? So we're kind of extra covered in Indiana to make sure that we don't miss doing that. We generally write an IEP, or an individualized education program, for a full year, but not always. There are some students that we're writing a plan that's pretty short term, and we're going to meet again for whatever reason. But it can last up to a year. It can't be written for even 1 day longer than a year. But it never expires. And so I think, a lot of people get stressed about, oh my gosh, the parent couldn't meet by this ACR date, and we had to push the meeting into next week to get the parent there. But the IEP is going to be gone for so many days. It's never really gone. It stays there until you get something new in place. But we just want to make sure that we're always as timely as we can with these things. So we review it at least annually. And again, there are certain situations that make you review it more often, such as if a student is in like on a homebound placement or a very restricted placement, we're going to meet much more frequently. And then we also collect progress on the student's goals, and we report that off to parents at least as often as we report other things to all students' parents. Meaning, if I get my report card every 9 weeks, then we have to report on the student's goals to the parents every 9 weeks. We collect data along the way, right? We want lots of data points to be able to tell us then what the progress is looking like. But if you're on a trimester system, it's going to be different. If you do 6 weeks, it's going to be different. So follow whatever it is that your school does. And then move-ins. Move-ins are always fun, right? Because sometimes we get parents who show up and you say, now, does your child have an IEP? Nope. And you find out 2 weeks later, yes, they did. And they were in a self-contained setting. And I mean, you find out lots of things that parents, it's important that front office staff know that the lingo is different. Even within Indiana, one building to the next, they may call it an IEP. They may just call it a program. They may refer to it as resource. I mean, people use terminology very different, and other states have different lingo too. And so we try to get the information we can from the parent, and then we get right on that process of trying to get records from the previous school. Now, when a parent comes in and says, my child has an IEP, I don't happen to have a copy of it, and by the way, my school that the kid came from is on spring break for the next 2 weeks, so you won't be able to contact anybody there. You go with what the parent says. Err on the side of, let's just provide whatever they need until we know differently. Because we have to enroll the student right away. You can't say, come back when you got your IEP, come back when we get ready for you. We enroll them right away, and we do the best we can based on what we know until we can hold a meeting. And we have to hold that meeting within 10 instructional days of the day that the kid moved in or came to enroll in our building. So that 10 days is all about, let's gather the records if we can, and if not, we still need to provide some good present levels. We need to collect a little data. We want to try to get to know the student. So we're going to gather all that information, and then we're charged with either writing an IEP or basically saying, yeah, the one the kid came with, that looks beautiful, we can do that, and you can accept that IEP, which usually for us just means you're going to write that IEP again in Indiana terms. We occasionally will get a kid who moves in the middle of an evaluation, which is, again, another issue that we have to deal with. But technically, the way the law is written, the timeline that was originally set, if you can meet that timeline, you should. But many times you can't. And so what you have to do is just negotiate a new timeline with the parent of here's how long I think it'll take to get it done. Now, you can't exceed another 50 days, of course, but you can say, okay, I've had kids moved in and they had all but like one piece done of an evaluation. I'm like, I think I can get that done and we can conference within the original deadline. Or it may just be that you say, I'd like another 50 days so we have a good chance to get to know the student, so teachers get to know them so they can provide some additional information. A lot of things can kind of affect what you think there, but you work it out with the parents and agree to a new timeline. So the big thing for administrators is, number one, just to be aware that these timelines are out there and making sure that that you've got procedures and processes in place to ensure compliance. A lot of times when timelines are not met, there's a hitch somewhere. either it's taking too long to get notice back to the multidisciplinary team that this evaluation even exists, right? If you don't tell me until 3 weeks into my timeline that, oh, by the way, this kiddo is for you to test, you run the risk of it not happening on time. If there are policies and procedures about making sure that if a teacher has that conversation with a parent at parent-teacher conferences and the parent says certain things, that they know to immediately complete this form that alerts somebody, or to report it to you, or whatever that procedure may be. You got to look at what you already have in place, and then making sure that everybody's got kind of an awareness of their own roles and responsibilities when it comes to this. And part of that responsibility tends to be in making sure that the data and rating scales and things like that from gen ed teachers get back in a timely manner. If I'm spending a lot of time tracking down rating scales and that's what's holding me up, then that could be a problem too. Because again, with initial evaluations, one missed timeline and you are out of compliance for your district. One single kiddo. That's a hard thing to swallow, but that's why it's so important.
Angela, I know we're going to transition into implementation. Just a question for Tammy and Kara. Do you have procedures and processes in place in your district, and do administrators have access to that where they can go right to it and go, yes, okay, check, I know we need to do that? Are those in place in your districts that you're aware of?
We partner with the South Harrison Exceptional Learners Co-op, and they have people in place that keep us in our place, if you know what I'm saying.
Good.
So yes, we do. And I don't know, it's just kind of a well-oiled machine, but the issues that we're having, we don't have any like compliance or timeline issues or anything like that. We have other things that are going on. So, but I feel like for that, we're in a pretty tight run ship on that.
That's good. You've never been on our radar, so that's a good thing. All right, implementing the IEP. So once we have an IEP, we have specific guidance about how quickly do we have to get it in place. So what the law says is that when we get parent consent for that initial placement in special education, so the very first time that we have to get that IEP in place, all the services and supports and accommodations and anything else that we put in this plan, no later than the 10th school day after we got consent. Now, for most people, I'd say the most common practice is if we got a signature today, we start it tomorrow. But there are some times when you get a kid that you don't have a program ready and waiting, and you gotta make some things happen before it's ready for them to start. Or occasionally you will have a teacher who says, can we just finish out this week and start it on Monday, right? And that is perfectly okay, as long as it's within that 10-day window after getting parent consent for implementation. Now, it's a little bit different when you have those IEPs that came after the first one. So no longer are we required to get a signature to make it happen. The expectation is you are in until you're not, right? You're in the system until there's something that removes you from it. So when we hold an IEP meeting that is after that first one, then first of all, we have 10 business days. So remember I said there were going to be some that were different. We have 10 business days to actually get a copy of that IEP to the parent. That gives us a few days if we need to be able to, spell check it, look for grammar, make sure we use the right name throughout, clean up any details, and then get that to the parent. But all the discussion that happened within that IEP meeting still happened within the meeting. There's no work other than cleanup that happens after that IEP meeting because the right people aren't there anymore. So we have the discussion, we make the decisions, and then we make sure and get a copy to the parent within 10 business days. Now that business days is important because of things like, say your school ends on May 15th, and we held a meeting on May 14th, we wouldn't want to wait until the beginning of August to get the parent a copy of the IEP. We want to make sure that as normal business banking days happen, that that we're still finishing things up. So that can sometimes affect things like conferences right before spring break or Christmas break or things like that. So making sure that we're always compliant with that piece. Then the parent has a little window. Once they get that copy in their hands, so I've got something to visually look at that the school has provided this offer, basically. I have 10 school days, so instructional days, to peruse it, make sure that I'm on board. I'm not going to go back and ask for little changes. Either that IEP is going to go in place on the 11th day after I've gotten it, or I have I have 3 different options that as a parent that I could pursue to say, no, I'm not happy with this. Saying I'm not happy doesn't do anything. Saying, well, I'm not signing that doesn't do anything. Parents can either ask for mediation, file for due process, or, and this is the easier option that I would encourage you to consider, they can ask for a meeting with somebody at the school who has the authority to negotiate the differences of opinion there, which means they might sit down with Roxanne, or they might sit down with you and say, you know, I'm not happy with this and here's why, and can we work out this difference and make some changes? If not, the IEP that you proposed will go into effect automatically. That's just the way the law works. And again, that's part of that is making sure that parents have their rights and parents have some recourse, but they can't hold up new IEPs just because they were unhappy with, you know, this verb or, you know, something kind of insignificant. So the law also says, and this one just kind of cracks me up, the IEP must be implemented as written. What exactly does that mean? I mean, how would you interpret that?
It means what it says.
It really does. I mean, it's a good faith offer of service, and we know that life happens, right? And that maybe we put something in an IEP that says, you know, we're going to have 60 minutes of speech therapy 3 times a month. And then our speech therapist, our only speech therapist, had maternity leave. And we're like, okay, what do we do? Right? We're still obligated to try and find a way or eventually make up for that service. Absolutely. But sometimes things get twisted a little bit, and maybe we didn't provide it as we said, but we have to figure out a way to make it happen. There is so much that's in an IEP. I mean, it is a complex document, and our teachers of record have a huge number of responsibilities for making all these things happen. So we're monitoring the goals, we're providing services, we're trying to stick with the plan as it's written. We make sure accommodations happen. We make sure any modifications happen that are specified. If there are extended school year services, we have to plan for those. There's just lots and lots to it.
That's why it's critical too, when you have an IEP that comes from another district, before accepting that at face value, to really look at those goals, look at that specially designed instruction, because we are bound to that. Once we say, okay, this is what we'll do, this is what we'll use, you know, we're legally bound to follow that. But if it's written in such a way that the student is not going to make progress, which is legally what is required under case law, if it's not written in that way, and or the specially designed instruction is not tailored to the student's needs for them to make progress, we're in trouble. So I just urge schools to really look at those move-in students, their IEPs, to make sure it is written to a high quality that we can live with.
So in general, our teachers of record are kind of the lead person that are responsible for making sure that the IEP gets implemented. And they do have to have appropriate licensure to be able to do that. Or, if we sometimes are running into issues across the state where we're just trying to find living bodies and getting them into the programs that they need. But we want to make sure that we've got the right people doing the right job. But ultimately, administrators are responsible for the people that they supervise. And so you are the key people that have to make sure that all the wheels are turning, which means you got to have at least the level of awareness of what they should be doing to make sure they're doing it. So I'm going to actually skip this for now because I know, Tammy, you're running short on time too.
I just wanted to say that if I could insert this. So prior to me getting here, they never they didn't write down every little thing that they did. They have a schedule, they go to this room, they work with those students and everything. And recently we had an issue where a student was going to didn't qualify when they reevaluated them, and one of the teachers that's a little bit new didn't just, I guess, thought that she could just not do something that wasn't going to be needed. They kind of jumped ahead of the game, so to speak. So we have now a document that they have to, in an Excel spreadsheet, it has some drop down boxes we've put in there, and they have to be specific about what they did, who delivered the service and everything. So there's a better trail of making sure that the IP is being met. But that's what I was saying. We didn't really struggle with the time constraints, but we did have a little glitch not too long ago. But it's a learning opportunity as well to fix what was broken. So,
and I think you hit on a good point. We have a lot of districts who, when they get questioned about something that they maybe have been doing a great job of completing, like if you have a parent who says, you haven't been giving my son extra time, but you have, well, if you had no way of documenting it, how do you ever prove that you did? It's just word against word, and that makes it really difficult. So
it is, and there are more and more parents doing that. It's like there's something in the water right now. Just with social media and everything, one person gets on there and airs their dirty laundry about an experience they had, and then before you know it, it's been shared 2,000 times, and then everybody starts saying, well, my child isn't. So that's just, I don't know, that's where we are now.
Different world, definitely. A little bit about fidelity. We know that fidelity is important no matter what you're talking about, whether you're talking about special education, whether you're talking about following a behavior plan, doing an intervention, implementing the reading curriculum. We know that success really falls back on the level of fidelity that we have. So if we're talking about an IEP, the fidelity of the IEP has to do with, here's what we said we were going to do. How close did we get to actually doing that all the time? Because we miss things. There are going to be times when somebody misses giving extended time and the kid didn't speak up and there was a sub for the day. I mean, there's all crazy things that happen all the time. Or, there were field trips 2 weeks in a row and the teacher didn't get all their minutes in with the student because they had other things going on. Well, those things just happen. So I think anytime that as an administrator, you can make sure that fidelity is happening to the greatest extent that it can be. And sometimes that comes in the way of training and collaboration time and things like that. If I'm a gen ed teacher and you've got a complicated behavior plan for a student and I haven't been following it, it may be because I don't get how to follow it, or it's unclear the way it's written, what I'm supposed to do, or the communication is not there. And I thought somebody else was going to handle this once it hit that point. So just making sure that whatever support is needed to increase that fidelity of implementation is really important. All right, let's jump into meetings and then we'll move on to behavior. So etiquette, and I'm not talking about which fork to use, but just making sure that we have good general procedures happening within meetings can really make a big difference. Want to be there and make it evident that you want to be there and that this student is important and that I'm really invested in what happens during this meeting. The administrator leads the way on this stuff. So making sure that you show up on time and you don't leave early. Hard to do, I know, but as the public agency representative, which I would assume that most of you will be serving as in most meetings, you are a required member, which means you should be there for every minute of that conference unless there is a formal written excusal from the parent. And I think I just wouldn't want to be, unless, you know, a fire happens in the cafeteria, I'm running out of that room and I'm going to go deal with it, right? But in most cases, these are things that could wait. And I just need to be committed to the meeting. Know as much about as you can about the child and the family, not to the Jerry Springer extent of knowing things about them, but you know, if you just know a couple of things, that this kid plays basketball, that this kid really likes Minecraft, sometimes that is all it takes to have your in and be connected and really make somebody believe that you do know my child. It's hard to know everyone. I mean, I'm sure all administrators try, but man, it's hard when you get a lot of kids. Again, making sure that you share the notice of procedural safeguards. And I would encourage you to get good at this so that you can be the model for your special ed teachers so that they can start taking on this role better. Because it's not a strong point at case conferences. It typically is not. And understanding that this student's particular needs are what drive what we do, not our staffing ratios, not our finances. None of that matters. So making sure that we don't ever get pulled into the, oh, we can't do that. We've never done that. I don't have enough staff to do that. If the data says it needs to happen, we make it happen. Problem is most of the time data says that it's really not needed. Like a lot of parents will ask for, I want a one-on-one aid, right? Unless we have the data to support that this student would need a one-on-one paraprofessional, then you shouldn't be offering those kinds of services. It shouldn't be part of the plan. When we go out and do facilitated IEP meetings for districts when they request it, and when the parent has also either requested or both parties have signed off. And when we do, we always use an agenda. And the agenda, most of the time when I use an agenda, it is not this detailed. This is kind of a little bit of everything that you're going to do throughout the process. But I use an agenda partly to show that there is a sequential kind of process that needs to happen and we don't skip around. We can't talk about goals until we know where a student's present levels are, and we can't write services until we know what the goals are. I mean, it's a very logical flow going through the IEP process. But it helps me as a facilitator, and it could help you as an administrator who tends to facilitate your own case conferences, that if somebody, at the start of the meeting said, well, but what room are they going to be in? Say, hang on, let's look at our agenda. We're going to be talking in services and placement. That's where we'll talk about, exactly where this is going to happen. We'll get there. I promise we'll get there. We will address your concerns, but not until we've gotten through these other things. And usually it just it refocuses everyone, but it also legitimizes to whoever brought that up that it is coming. We're not ignoring you. We just have to do these other things first. So I would always use an agenda with a case conference meeting, and one that's either up on a chart or printed out so that you can physically point to it and get the group back on track. Again, if you have required members, and we always have required members, those people have to be there from start to finish, and they have to be represented unless there is a written excusal, prior written excusal, which means before the conference ever even starts, to leave for the whole conference or for part of it. So public agency representative, that is most likely you guys. A teacher of record always has to be there. A gen ed teacher that is not just some random gen ed teacher, but a gen ed teacher of the student. Or sometimes at the beginning of the year, you may have somebody from last year that attends as their gen ed teacher, and that's okay. An instructional strategist, which often is the teacher of record, unless there is somebody there who is representing the multidisciplinary team from a recent evaluation. Like if we're going to initial conference, I'll be the instructional strategist as the psychologist. But it's just somebody who can make sense of the last evaluation and the progress monitoring and all of the data that we have, and see how that connects to now what do we do? What does this mean for the IEP? And then if it's an initial, you do have to have a member of the multidisciplinary team that evaluated the student that is there. It doesn't have to be the psychologist. It often is for anything other than speech impairment or language impairment, but it could be somebody else that was part of that team. So if you don't have that prior written consent, you can't excuse. And if something happens where somebody says, yeah, but I have to leave, well, then you need to table that meeting and reschedule to finish it out. If the parent is not on board with that. There's another piece to this too, and I don't think I have a bullet point on that, but when, say for example, Tammy, if you were the English teacher and you were going to be there for part of the meeting and you were going to discuss things that were relevant to the student and you needed to leave, then you would need to get written excusal from the parent. If you weren't going to be able to be there at all and the parent said, that's okay, I'm okay with going through the meeting without her there, you would need to submit something in writing that provided your input to the IEP. So probably some information about present levels, the accommodations you're using, what you think about for goals to work on, anything like that. And that's one piece that I think schools often forget is we need to have, it's not only to the IEP team, but to the parent that written input needs to happen. So public agency representatives, again, administrators are often the public agency representative or the PAR, and there has to be one every time. And you have to be able to meet 3 criteria to be a PAR. You have to basically know what the resources are and have the authority to commit to those resources. You have to be qualified to either provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction. So you either got to have a special ed background or a good supervisory background to do that. And then you also have to have good knowledge about the general education curriculum. And principals tend to fit that role. Oftentimes your assistant principals, if you're lucky enough to have an assistant principal, you can designate somebody else to sit in that role, but you got to really think about who meets all three criteria that you are comfortable with handing your authority over to them when it comes to that meeting, because there has to be somebody at the meeting who can make decisions. It never can happen where you have a meeting and whoever's in charge says, well, I don't know if I can commit to that. I'm going to have to talk to some people. Doesn't work that way. That's what the PAR's role is, which is why it's important to have somebody there. But, you know, I've heard people say, well, I can't commit to assigning an aide for your child. Well, either the data says the kid needs an aide and we will figure it out on our end, or the data says he doesn't need that. Same thing with transportation. You know, I'm gonna have to call the transportation director. Not the child's problem. If they need it, we say yes to it, and then we arrange it after the meeting. So go ahead.
I was just going to say it's critical to jump ahead on that and be aware, meeting with the teacher of record and saying, hey, what are some issues? What are you hearing about? If you get, yeah, I got a call from them. They were asking about extended school year, or, okay, let's talk about that now so that when we get in the meeting, we're not caught off guard. Can't always happen. That things are, I can't say that things aren't brought up, of course, but yeah, just prep as much as you can by getting together with even the superintendent, the director, and saying, hey, here's what I'm hearing. What are your thoughts? So,
yeah,
prepared.
I mentioned predetermination, and predetermination is something that, and Tammy, we'll go ahead and record this. Predetermination, we never want to get caught in a situation where what we have done would constitute predetermination. So if we make decisions without getting parent input, that's predetermination. If we had a meeting before the meeting, we are allowed to have a meeting before the meeting. Many schools have meetings before the meetings, but they can't make decisions there. And they can't say, you know, now when it comes time, you all are going to agree with me on this, right? I mean, that is predetermination. If we've made any of those kinds of decisions. We only determine placement at a case conference. We can consider multiple placements. We can look into them, but we only make those decisions within a case conference with the necessary people there. We do want to make sure that we have meaningful parent participation, and part of that comes from making sure that we schedule a meeting at a mutually agreed upon time and place. Now, this means we've got to flex a little, and the parents have got to flex a little. And usually parents are a lot more flexible the more notice we give them. You know, if somebody asks me if I can meet next week, my time is already really tight. You know, I've got a lot of things scheduled. But if somebody talks to me about setting up a meeting for next month, then I can plan for that, even around a work schedule. I think a lot of parents are like, well, I'm only off on certain days. If we can make it work on their day off, absolutely we want to do that. But we can't, I mean, we sometimes will get very rigid requests from the school or from the parent, a school who says, well, we can only meet during this hour because that is when the gen ed teacher's prep period is, and we don't want to have coverage. Well, if that doesn't work, that doesn't work. Or a parent who says, I can only meet after 5 on a Saturday, that's probably not going to work. That's not going to be mutually agreed upon by the school, because you've got all of your required people that need to be there. But again, the further we back it up, and the more that we can offer different potential ways of participating, whether it's a Zoom meeting or a conference call or you know, whatever, those things can make a difference in getting good parent participation. It's important that we document both the parent and, if the student is there, the student voice. So it shouldn't just be that my only voice as a parent shows up in parent concerns. It should be that I'm giving input throughout the IEP, and that if I did have concerns, that either my input is considered and incorporated into the IEP, or that there's some explanation for why we did consider this, but it was not what the rest of the team felt was appropriate. Parents are equal participants, and we need to make sure that, I think the first big step in that is making parents aware that it is not the team and the parent, that it is the team that includes the parent. And sometimes they just don't know that. They're not used to operating in that way when working with schools. Just a list of some things that you never, ever, ever want to say at a case conference. And I won't read these to you, but some of these have come from things that we have heard in times where they knew we were there at this meeting, and they still said them, right? And you would think that some of this is common sense, but it's hard. I mean, occasionally you hear somebody slip into using another student's name. Like, no, we're only talking about Jimmy at this conference. We don't talk about anybody else. His information is confidential, and so is any other student. And that the very last bullet, though, I mean, well, for this ACR, we hope to discuss the BIP since we just completed the FBA, and you just know that you sometimes will have parents who have that look like, are you speaking a foreign language? Because none of this makes any sense to me. I try really hard not to talk like an educator when I am in these meetings, because we so easily slip into our own lingo, our own vernacular, and we want to make sure that we're using language that is friendly to everyone who is there, regardless of their background.
Nothing tells a parent they're not part of the team more quickly than using jargon.
True. We know that all students have the basic right of a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And for most kids, that should be in the general education setting for most of their day. I mean, that's one of the things that we strive for as part of providing good, inclusive education. We want kids to be with their general ed peers. Now, when that is not going to be the most appropriate option, we have to document that really well. We have to justify any kind of removal from my non-disabled peers. If I need pullout, I need it, but tell me why I need it. Not because that's just what we do, not just because that's the way it fits into the schedule, or our special ed teachers always do reading pullout at second grade. That's not. This has to be individualized for me and my needs. And we are obligated, before considering pulling a student away from that gen ed setting, we are obligated to think about, is there a way that we could make it work by changing some things up, by adding in supplementary aids and services, any kind of accommodations or modifications that are needed, all of those things that are really important within the gen ed setting. Unfortunately, it's almost easier to do a little bit of pull-out instruction than it is to make it work in the gen ed setting. But that's not the way the law reads. So we have to go there first. We know there are a lot of different potential placements. There's a whole range of least restrictive environment. And it's not the least, it is what's least restrictive for the student.
Child.
And we do have some students who need a hospital setting, who need a separate school, who need quite a bit of time pulled out in order to get their needs met. But again, most students are going to be at that green end of the continuum where they can get what they need in a gen ed setting with some additional supports. And we always start at that end. So think about this as far as being an administrator. We sometimes will have students who have been in a mostly general education setting for their instruction, and then something happens and they stick them on homebound. That is a long road from one end of that continuum to the other without having tried anything in between. And it really, it forces us to think about the fact that we need to take this in steps, and we need to see, is there something that is much less restrictive than a homebound kind of placement that we could do that might provide what the student needs before jumping all the way to that end. So a couple of key messages from this when you're talking about case conferences and all those different opportunities. Every time we interact with parents, that we've got the potential to build that relationship. Every single interaction, even if it comes after a negative incident, we have the opportunity to continue to build that relationship. Every member on the case conference committee is an important member. And I think as administrators, making sure that you emphasize the importance of your staff as well as the importance of the parents. So gen ed teachers, they need to know why they're there. They need to know what to bring, what data to share. They need to know that they are not just checking a box, they are filling a needed role on that case conference committee. As administrators, really your focus should be on managing the process of the meeting and the environment and the conversation rather than the content, because you're typically not the one instructing the student. You may have some data to share as far as maybe some disciplinary stuff or something like that, but the critical role for an administrator is managing the flow, managing the people, and making sure that everything happens the way it needs to. And the more procedures and processes, like an agenda, having some ground rules, setting some roles of a timekeeper, a note taker, etc. Those kinds of things can help meetings run a lot more smoothly. Well, I'm going to try to cram behaviors into about 17 minutes or so. We'll see how that goes. So let's start with the prevention piece and just responding to behaviors. It is critical that we've got solid tier 1 instruction related to these things. If we just assume that we can address all behaviors by putting the fear of consequences into students, it's not going to work. Having good solid instruction on what we do want helps to prevent a lot of the things that we don't want. Making sure that we've also got some tier 2 and tier 3 supports in place for behavior and mental wellness that can teach the skills that we identify that are lagging, but with a lot more focus. So it's not a general behavior support, it is a focused, targeted behavior support that is designed for this student. And all of this really applies to both non-disabled and disabled students alike. We need to emphasize relationship building, and we need to model it from the administrative level and from the teacher level, just making sure that we value those relationships. Provide the support that the teachers need. Sometimes they need some additional instruction or support around positive behavior supports, classroom management skills. If you go into your classroom and you see that your teachers are still using a clip chart or a card system, time to make the change. Finding something that actually works and it is a positive kind of system. Make sure that if there are kids that are on your radar, that you make the connections, you seek them out, you check in with them from time to time, and you make sure that they know that you know their name. and that you're keeping an eye out for them in a positive way, not I got my eye on you, but more about I'm with you, I'm here for you. When addressing behavior, when things do happen, showing value of that student-teacher relationship is really important. And so making sure that you have ways that don't undermine that. And I think sometimes those are things like, instead of a teacher sending a student to the office to be addressed for whatever the situation is, having the administrator go down and take over the class for 5 minutes while the teacher pulls the student out and addresses the behavior directly. It helps to keep that relationship intact and doesn't undermine the teacher's, both the relationship and the authority. And then considering any consequences that might involve instruction. So a day out teaches me that I could get a day out by doing this behavior, sitting in detention. Yeah, it may be a little painful, but I'm not sure what it teaches me. But having a consequence that involves instruction around the skill that I need can make a lot more impact. So things happen though. We can prevent, and that's great. And we want to do that.
Yeah.
But when behaviors happen, rather than just the reaction of, let's look at the book, how many days out does that say? What's the consequence? Think about the things that are behind it. So can we change the environmental conditions that might have led to that behavior? Was the adult behavior part of the situation? Sometimes we know kids are triggered by certain people or by certain situations, or, you could see it coming. Ask whether the student already has a behavior intervention plan. And if so, did we follow it? That's critical. That is something that can truly get schools into hot water, when the student has a behavior plan and then we didn't follow that plan. Ask whether the student truly had the skill to do the right thing in that situation. Some of our kids don't. And if so, we need to teach it. And not only do we teach it, it's not just let me re-instruct you on what I want you to do. It's then providing situations to practice that skill, to reinforce that skill when I see it, and to make sure that we can generalize it to other areas. I mean, there are tons of questions that you ask rather than, let's see what the manual says about what the consequence should be, because typically those consequences are not effective with most of our students with disabilities. If so, we would never need a behavior plan. We just always look to the code of conduct and follow it, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
So when we have a removal, the law says that it doesn't really talk in terms of suspension, expulsion. It talks in terms of removals. And if you remove a student for any part of the day, whether it's 20 minutes or a full day, it counts as a full day of removal. So be very cautious with using any removals. If you absolutely have to, do it very strategically. The only time that it really doesn't count is if it is a short-term removal that is pursuant to the student's IEP. And what that really means is, if I have maybe built into my behavior plan that this student is, let's say it's a student with diabetes that's identified for other health impairment, and when they have a severe sugar spike, things are going to go down, like we just know. And so as part of the plan, if we hit this level or above, the student is going to be sent home to rest for the rest of the day. That is different than saying this student needs to go home for the rest of the day because of their behavior. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. There are very few situations where we would really have this built into the IEP. It would need to be very clear why a removal might be part of that behavior plan. So suspension for any part of a day is a removal. In-school suspension is also considered a removal unless As part of that in-school suspension, the student has the opportunity to continue to make progress in the general ed curriculum. They receive all their special ed services that are listed in the IEP. Not an easy task. And they participate with non-disabled students to the extent they would in their current placement. Now, if you've got a big in-school suspension area and you have a lot of frequent flyers and you've got a good mix of gen ed and special ed students, that might not be so difficult. But for a lot of your buildings, what you have is if you had a student in school, they may be the only one. And if I'm the only one and I'm isolated all day, and that's not what my typical placement is, you're going to have to count it as a day of removal. So just makes it difficult.
It does.
The other situation is bus suspensions, bus removals. If I ride the regular bus and I don't have transportation on my IEP and I littered on the bus and got kicked off for a day, it's up to my parents whether they want to bring me to school or not. If I don't show up to school, it's an absence, right? But it's not a removal. Now, if I have transportation listed on my IEP as a special related service, and I am removed from the bus for whatever reason, it is counted as a day of removal unless we figure out another way to get the kid to school, whether it's paying the parents' mileage to drive them there, or arranging for an Uber, or principal shows up in their minivan and picks the kid up, whatever. If you can get the kid to school, it's not a removal. If you told them they can't ride the bus and the bus is part of the IEP and they don't show up, it's a day of removal. That's what I get for trying to talk fast. Okay, so now at this point, if a student is removed for more than 10 days in a row, automatically we know that is considered a disciplinary change of placement, which means certain actions now need to happen. But it can also be that I rack up more than 10 days across the span of the school year, so in a cumulative way, but non-consecutive. Then the school is left to figure out, did a change of placement occur? And I will tell you that almost all schools in the state of Indiana, they don't even bother with this step. They say if we get to more than 10 days, we're just going to assume it's a change of placement and hold a manifestation so that there's no question. But there can be some situations where every one of my behaviors throughout the year was so different and so spaced out that there really wasn't a pattern, didn't seem to be related, and that's a possibility. So when you've got a change of placement, a disciplinary change of placement, because of all my days of removal, number one, remember the public agency has to get a copy of the notice of parent or notice of procedural safeguards to the parent on that day that the decision is made to hand down whatever discipline that is going to eventually take me over my 10 days. So maybe I've only had 3 days out and I got caught smoking at school. And the principal said, you know what? That's a 10-day suspension for that. 10 days will take me up to 13. And so on the day that the principal says, you're going to be out for 10 days, they also need to give the notice of procedural safeguards. Occasionally that can't happen. Maybe something happened at the ball game and nobody even can get to that notice right then. If it can't happen on the day of, then they have to go in the mail the next business day. That's the backup plan. And then we have to hold a manifestation determination conference within 10 instructional days of that decision, not of necessarily of the incident, not of the 10 days of the day that I would cross over the 10-day line, 10 days from when that decision is made to hand down those removals. So in order to keep us on track for all of this, we got to have really good communication. We got to make sure that everybody knows what a day of removal is so that we're not adding them up differently. We have to make sure that administrators and the teachers of record are talking when these incidents happen so that we can start trying to get good plans ahead of time so we don't get to that point. That if my kiddo's in ISS for the day, that if I'm going to try to make that not a removal, I'm going to need to know that as a teacher of record so I can try to get in there and get all their services met and meet all those requirements. But the earlier that we know about these different issues, the better. And sometimes in some schools, the teacher of record may have very little contact with a student. If they are the teacher of record, but there are other providers that are teachers of service, they may not hear about the fact that a student has gotten in, trouble multiple times until after the fact. And we want to know those things early. All right, I got 5 minutes to talk about manifestation meetings. So it is truly an evaluative process, and it is done by the case conference committee, which means there is not like a ruler of these meetings. It, like any other case conference, the team is what determines the outcome, and they have to use all the information. And they're using the information to figure out whether or not what I got in trouble for was caused by my disability or had a direct and substantial relationship to my disability, or potentially was caused because school didn't follow the IEP. They didn't implement my IEP. Sometimes that happens. So we're going to review all of the relevant information, and you want to stick to what happened in general, what the behaviors were like, and then we've got to know about my disability. Not just that I have whatever disability it is, but what does it look like? What are the characteristics for me of that disability? And where we get into a lot of trouble are when we have students with ADHD and you say, well, this was an impulsive act. Yeah, but if an impulsive kid with ADHD, because some kids are not, then it doesn't make sense, right? So we've got to know what my disability looks like and what teachers are seeing, what parents are seeing in the classroom, and then analyze that behavior and say, is it related? Is it not? It's a hard decision to make. We also need to think about, are there any other disabilities suspected? Sometimes there are other things that aren't on the IEP, but we all know they're there. And if we know they're there, we're obligated to consider them as part of the package. And then that big critical piece of, if there was already a behavior plan, did we follow it? Absolutely critical, because if we didn't, you might as well just say it was a failure to implement the IEP because we didn't implement the behavior plan. So if we say yes to either one of those questions, then we say yes, it is a manifestation of the student's disability. Now, if it was because we didn't implement the IEP, we got to figure out why it wasn't implemented and fix it. I mean, that's our kind of our first step. So think about, is it because we didn't know how to do it? Was it a communication issue? Is it because, we didn't have somebody covering the back hall and things happen in the back hall? Whatever it is, fix that issue. And regardless of which question we might have said yes to, what the law says is now we have to conduct a functional behavioral assessment and put a behavior plan in place, unless we already have them. And if so, we better take a good hard look at them and see, do they need to be updated? Do they need to be tweaked? What needs to happen? Because obviously something went wrong. In this case, then the student goes right back to the placement they came from, regardless of if the student had been recommended for expulsion, and we said the student, this is related to their disability, they go right back to whatever placement they were in, and we're not moving forward with any additional disciplinary consequences. Unless at that meeting, the parent and the public agency agree to a change of placement that has to do with modifying their behavior intervention plan. If the parent's not on board, they have to go back where they were. That's just the bottom line. Sometimes, though, we have behaviors that were not related to the disability, and if that's the case, we can proceed with any disciplinary procedures up and including expulsion. However, a student with a disability, their education cannot just stop. So the case conference, then, their responsibility is to figure out what services they do need. And say if I go through and I get expelled for whatever reason, then we are typically providing homebound or some sort of alternative educational programming to make sure that I can keep making progress in the gen ed curriculum and keep making progress towards my goals. And whatever I did to get me in this hot water, we got to start working on that, because I am coming back eventually, and we need to make sure that that this doesn't occur again. The only exception to this really is related to drugs or weapons or inflicting serious bodily injury on another person. And then regardless of whether it had to do with my disability, that the school can remove a student to an interim alternative educational setting for up to 45 days. So we're still going to go through all the same procedures, but it is a little bit more protection. And I know we're past our time, but I'm going to keep talking just because we're required, or we're recording, and I'm going to take a couple extra minutes to go over some of this. It is important to know that serious bodily injury is not the potential of. Like, I have to have hurt someone bad enough to where they could have died, lost a limb, lost an eye. I mean, this is a very serious level of basically physical assault in order to qualify under this. Still, if I hurt somebody, we're still going to go through all these same procedures of the manifestation and looking at a functional behavioral assessment. But what it means is you can't remove me to a setting regardless of the situation, unless it rises to that serious level. It's kind of a little bit controversial, but this is what the federal government guidance has been. There have been specific pieces of correspondence that have gone out basically saying it has to be super serious. So make sure that your teachers are prepared. This is a case conference meeting, just like any other. So people should be bringing data, and they should really look into, what does this look like in my classroom? What does the student's disability look like? What do I see? And then just a little bit about, okay, now what, right? I bet I get a call once a week from someone who says, yeah, we did the manifestation thing, we brought the student back, and now they did something else that's suspendable. Well, now what do you do? Well, number one, is this the same as the last time? Have we revised the paperwork? Have we revised the functional behavioral assessment or the behavior plan? Is this still a situation where the placement is appropriate? What did we decide last time, right? Sometimes the kid gets in trouble for the same thing. The last time we knew it was related to their disability. So we're going to have the same meeting again, right? Because you do have to have another meeting, which is the hard part. You don't get a reset on those 10 days. You're going to have a meeting again. And then I think the bottom line is, did the removal work last time? No, if it didn't, it's probably not going to work this time. What else could we do? And any day beyond that first 10 days, we are obligated to provide services to the student. And so we have to make sure that is continuing to happen. So just some takeaways from this too. Anytime that you can predict a behavior, you can usually prevent it. And so the more that we know about a student's behavior, the better. Relationships are key to this. I mean, John said it before, this is absolutely important that we're building those relationships. In order to get good compliance with these procedures, communication is absolutely critical. And every kid that we don't have the kid under our roof is a lost opportunity for us to teach appropriate behavior, teach good social skills, all of the things that we're looking for. So just to wrap up, be looking for these things in your buildings. Be thinking about, as the administrator, am I seeing these things? These are the things you look for in a good, strong building where we are meeting the needs of students and we are staying on the positive end of compliance, and we're having low numbers of any kind of parent complaints or anything like that. So just thinking for long term, what do I do now? What's something I could do that either is related to increasing my relationships with students, or something I can change at a case conference that would just make it that much better? Just little things that you can do to make positive impact. And then what is a long-term goal that I want to achieve in order to really move that inclusive culture forward in my school district? So we appreciate you guys being with us. There is an evaluation component to this, and you'll get an email about this along with your certificate for participation, but we would appreciate any feedback, especially given that this was the first time presenting this in a virtual setting. Any kind of feedback would be great. So thank you very much.